The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and welcome to this 50 Acres Academy webinar. Thanks very much for joining. Today we're going to be looking at the election advertising and polling and how it works. Thinking about that, obviously it's very relevant at this very moment in time. As we all know, we're in the middle of an election, so it's a great time to be thinking about it. So let's get started and have a think about what is election advertising all about. So just out of interest, that's my husband's photo of Malcolm Turnbull on the election with the halo over his head. My husband works for Fairfax and is travelling with the Prime Minister for the duration of the election campaign. His name's Andrew Mears, so I thought I'd put a photo of his up on the front. So what we'll cover today: election advertising, what is it and how does it work? And polling, can it ever predict the result? So obviously there's a federal election at the moment, and you may have received some campaign calls or emails or SMS messages from political party candidates or political parties or interest groups. Why would they want to contact you? Is their intention to influence your voting behaviour, or do they want to raise your awareness about a candidate standing for election, a political party, or an issue? Obviously, that's the whole rationale behind getting in contact with people through an election campaign in various guises. So, what is election or electoral advertising? It's defined by subsection 328 brackets 5 of the Commonwealth Electoral Act 1918, which defines electoral advertising as an advertisement, handbill, pamphlet, poster, or notice that contains electoral matter but does not include an advertisement in a newspaper announcing the holding of a meeting. So there you go. So obviously it needs to be falling in within that, and I'm sure parties challenge each other when it doesn't. So what's an electoral matter? Subsection 4.1 of the Commonwealth Electoral Act defines electoral matter as a matter which is intended or likely to affect voting in an election. So obviously, what is digital marketing and campaigning, really good for in the sense of this election campaign? What's electoral matter, really? Subsection 4, let's drill down a bit further. 4 in brackets 9 further states that matter shall be taken to be intended or likely to affect voting in an election if it contains an express reference to or comment on the election, the government or opposition, previous government or previous opposition, etc., goes on, or an issue around that election. So it obviously is a pretty broad definition. The period of election advertising defines an electoral period as the period commencing on the day of issue of the writ of the election and ending at the latest time on polling day at which an elector in Australia could enter a polling booth for the purpose of casting a vote in the election. So obviously that's over in Western Australia, where they can cast their votes 2 hours later than those on the East Coast. And by the way, if anyone has a question, please just pop it in the question box and I'll get to them as we go. So electoral advertising on the internet has a separate definition. I'm sure this has been amended later than 1918 because we didn't have the internet in 1918, but there's a whole lot of rules that pertain to advertising in terms of the internet as well. And by the way, you'll be able to get access to the recording of this and also the slides, which we'll send out to everyone. So what does this all mean, and how does it affect us? Well, this election, it's 8 weeks. It's a very long one. It's 55 days. We're now into week 2. What can we expect to see? Well, pamphlets in the mail, seeing our local political candidates at street stalls, political party balloons flying around at community events, and policy manifestos being communicated, amongst many other things. A lot of them, one of the big things that you probably heard already is the theme is trust me. They're talking about trust. They always talk, it's a common theme this particular election. They've both been mentioning it in their ads. And of course, invariably, we will, of course, trust them, won't we? Because they're politicians. So there's some inherent fragility, I suppose, with that message. The rise of Facebook for electioneering. Facebook will be the dominant platform for communicating political messages during this election. The recent Victorian state election showed an increase in Facebook usage to reach political messages to difficult target audiences, such as those who live in marginal seats and young people. Seeing an increase in people going online to discuss political issues during election periods. And the visual is powerful, very powerful within social media content. Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, and Facebook, they'll all be used extensively this election. So polling, how does that work? Polling, as you know, it's the most prominent way of surveying research, using survey research to garner a snapshot of target audience opinions at a particular moment in time. As you can all recall, politicians often say, it's just a poll. The most important poll that counts is polling day. We've heard that before. But polling can be targeted to certain audiences, such as people who live in marginal seats, young people, working families, various other different communities, pensioners, the broader Australian public, etc., depending on what people wanted to poll and what group they wanted to talk to. Now, most commonly we see polls of either people in marginal seats, or we see people with polling in Australia as a whole, and both of those are very instructive in terms of indicating where the results are likely to be heading. And obviously, when governments or oppositions see movements in polls in one direction or another, it gives them some hope, some excitement, renewed energy, etc., etc., etc. As you know, we haven't seen polls for a few days now. I think it's such a long campaign that the various media outlets are not polling as extensively as they may have in a shorter election. So, polling. Who organises them? Companies such as Newspoll, Roy Morgan Research, Galaxy Polling, etc., AC Nielsen Polling, political parties, political candidates, and interest groups. They all do polling. Anyone can do a poll. You can engage a polling company to do something for you about a particular issue, or you can do it in the context of in political party can do it and try to understand what's going on in the background. Political parties are absolutely polling all the time at the moment. They're in the field constantly to try and understand what people are thinking, and not just doing qualitative but doing quantitative as well. So what does polling tell us? Well, it provides us with a snapshot of voter intentions, issues that are important to the particular various target audiences, how much support there is for a policy initiative, what people like or dislike about a candidate, a party, for example, Prime Minister's colour choice of jacket or tie, their particular nuances in terms of language that they use or don't use. Their political parties are probably polling about that sort of stuff all the time, and it gives them a very good idea about what's working and not working about a candidate. when there is a talk about substituting or moving someone out and moving someone in, often the parties, the senior parties, poll privately, do private sort of focus groups on candidates, other potential leaders. So, for example, recently there was talk late last year about Bill Shorten being challenged by Anthony Albanese, which would have been a reasonably big process, because it requires a vote of the entire party, as well as a vote of the MPs themselves. Now, before they did that, I would bet that the senior party officials who would have deigned that it was needed to happen because of where Labor was at in the polls at that time, I would expect that they would have been polling in the background, or they would have done polling at some point about Anthony Albanese, to understand what works and what doesn't work for him as a potential political leader. That's obviously now not necessary because Labor's had a bit of a resurgence in the polls, but political parties often will test what works and what doesn't work. For example, they would have done a lot of quantitative, i.e. focus groups, where people are in a room and getting feedback on, what someone looks like, what they talk, what they say, what people don't like about what they say, all this sort of commentary about the Prime Minister being Mr. Harbourside Mansion. Is that hurting him? What do people think about that? What do they like about him that might balance that out, for example? Those sorts of things are all tested extensively by the parties, so that when they go out, when the politician, the Prime Minister himself or herself goes and talks to the punters, talks to the media, they're able to use that language that comes up repeatedly. So if people were told that they didn't like Tony Abbott's laugh, or whatever it was, he probably would have been instructed not to laugh less, talk more. It goes down to those very detailed scenarios. I was once working for Kim Beazley as an election advancer when he stood for in the election when he was Labor leader. And the polling was telling us at that time that people liked Kim Beazley, but those on the East Coast were not sure of him because he was overweight. And so as an election advancer, my job was to create the particular event that he was going to be at the following day or days, from the look and the feel to the policy and the announcement to the people that they were speaking to. And so we were instructed to do everything to make him, surround him with happy, smiling people because people like him, and obviously not to make him look, ungainly because of his weight. That was just one thing that we had to focus on. That was something that the polling had shown up, and that was a while ago. So, there is polling done all the time by political parties, and they would do the polling on each other. They'd be asking their focus groups what people like and don't like about Bill Shorten, what they like and don't like about other frontbench people, and all sorts of things. It's I suppose really used to strategize, and as a part of, in some respects, open warfare. And in some respects, it helps make those strategic moves. It backs it up with some amount of knowledge. It gives it a criteria to be based around, rather than just going, put on the pink tie today, or wear the brown suit. It gives the parties some sort of understanding that people like them in the dark suits, or they like them in the whatever else. They like them looking prime ministerial. They like them looking whatever they do. So it's really interesting how it works. So how does the polling work? In itself. George Gallup, who runs the Gallup polls, once said polling is like sampling soup. One spoonful can reflect the taste of the whole pot if the soup is well stirred, which means obviously you have to balance out that means in a psephologist's language that what they're trying to do is balance that sample size so that the sample is an accurate sample of the people that they are trying to reflect in that poll. So if they just got that sample from, one or two electorates, it wouldn't be an accurate read of the Australian population, but they have all sorts of ways of sort of pulling people and locations out of computers and then weighting them for age, etc., etc., ethnicity, etc., etc. We'll get onto that in just a second. Pollsters, how's it done? Well, pollsters aim to measure political opinion of the Australian population. They'll use a small sample of voters that accurately represent the Australian population, factoring in the following. This is what I'm talking about in terms of weighting: gender, ethnicity, and geographical location. Pollsters then make a mathematical equation that can accurately predict the outcome of election results. Obviously, not down to the very exact seat, but they're usually pretty good at it. And I'm sure some of you have seen Anthony Green and his work on election night, on the run up to election night, where he's in his element. These people spend an awful lot of time looking at small polls in little areas, in seat polls of marginal seats, looking at redistributions. There's been a redistribution before this election, so that makes polling even more interesting because they're not polling on the basis of the seats that were in place last election. The seats have changed. A lot of the seats have changed. In fact, pretty much most of them have changed to some extent. So it makes pollsters' lives more interesting, a little more challenging, a bit more fun. They've got to crunch more numbers. But us as observers from outside, we're not looking at apples with apples in terms of comparing last election's votes to this vote, but they can make some assessments based on geographical areas where the result of particular booths in areas and what that might be likely to do once the redistribution is factored in. And so the polling will help us to be instructive in terms of how that works. How's it done? Well, pollsters call completely random numbers. Obviously, as we know, most people are on mobiles these days, so people will call mobiles. You can take your mobile off the list, but many people don't. Pollsters then adjust the data to match the most recent census data to try and weight, as I said before, the actual people participating in that poll. Poll's bad for democracy. It's a question that we often hear because if the poll is pushing us in one direction or another, the media get, completely beside themselves. They think they've got something that they didn't have a couple of months ago, and so it's all on. Well, that's, I suppose it's arguable. We're not going to stop polls, and so yes, they probably do, impact on people's perceptions of what's going on. But as people probably know, a lot of people don't make their minds up. Certainly, swinging voters, and swinging voters are a significant, group these days. They're up to 20%, or even more of the electorate. Most of them don't make up their minds for the last 24 or 48 hours. Some of them don't even engage in the election itself. They're aware somehow in the background that there's an election going on, but they really don't engage in the detail. And they, obviously are reluctantly pulled, sometimes screaming and shouting, to the ballot box to cast their ballot. And they perhaps make that on the basis of a conversation they had that morning over the back fence, or at the front of the house, or wherever they were. So you've got to remember that, unlike probably most of you listening today, most people, there's a huge group of people who are not engaged in election campaigns at all. They certainly have a downside. They encourage the sort of whole horse race thing, and I for one am one of these people who was fascinated by politics, fascinated by elections, and enjoy nothing but a good night in front of the TV on election night, with lots of computers open, looking at, the AEC, call me boring. But I find them fascinating, but a lot of people don't. But encouraging that whole horse race thing certainly does that, and there is no two ways about that. We do see that, and it does create this story that may not necessarily be there. People may focus less on local candidate qualities and may put more emphasis on the leaders of political parties because of polls, I think, and large polling differences amongst political parties. Also, I think, arguably, maybe place limits on engaging citizens in democracy, because it's almost, if a particular political party is way out front, a lot of people go, oh well, there's no point. We know who's going to win. And so people become less engaged in the process, so they don't engage with independents or crossbenchers or just general issues. And so, yes, that's also, I think, a downside as well. So we've seen, we're almost coming to an end now, so this is a short one today, but if anyone's got any questions, please pop them up now, because we don't have long to go. Again, a couple of you weren't on at the beginning, but they're photos that my husband took whilst in Parliament. He's a chief photographer at Fairfax, and he's currently travelling with the Prime Minister. I think today they're in Adelaide. He's travelling about the place probably three or four times around Australia, I think, in the course of 8 weeks. He won't be coming home. So if you've got a question, please pop it in now. We've seen the influence that polls have, on our democracy, thinking about, where you might have sided in these particular debates around those leaders as they were vying for leadership of their own parties. There were polls about that, what people thought about that, and that had an influence on parties in turn. So in some cases, polls are not just about electoral results. They're about perceptions, they're about feelings, they're about a sense. And that can be very, very impactful on parties, and also very nebulous, which is a good and a bad thing. People decide they like or dislike someone, and it becomes this, urban myth about something they did or they didn't do once. And we then cease to see perhaps their positive contribution to debate and public policy determination, and then focus in on some of the negatives, which I think it does definitely have some sort of impact on what governments can do and politicians can do. So when you go to the call from a pollster in 2016, obviously participate. I love getting calls from pollsters. I don't get them very often, but I love participating in a poll. But I'm one of the weird ones. It'll be interesting to see what happens, and there must be a poll due out any day now. I think I haven't seen one for quite a few days, so I would expect there's going to be one out any day now. So thanks very much for taking part in this webinar. The next webinar will be about storytelling, becoming a better storyteller, how to promote your business or organisation. That's going to be in June, on June 16th at 11 a.m. Wednesday, June the 16th. So thank you very much for joining. I hope that's been helpful. We'll send out these slides, and we'll also put the recording up on our 50 Acres TV site, and we'll send you an email about that a bit later on in the day. Thank you very much, and have a great day. Thank you.